Before we start the story, I want you to plug in new earphones for better experience. Now let's continue. I've always been a bit of a night owl, especially when it comes to my passion, filmmaking. It's not just a career for me, it's an obsession. The idea of capturing something, of creating a story from nothing but images and sounds, is both exhilarating and consuming. So when I found myself wandering through a dimly lit flea market one chilly Saturday evening, I wasn't surprised. The air was thick with the scent of old books, antique furniture, and forgotten treasures. I had no idea what I was looking for, but I knew that something would catch my eye. I've been in a bit of a creative slump lately. My last project had flopped, and the pressure to come up with something original felt like an anchor around my neck. Everything I tried seemed too derivative, too safe. Horror, my favorite genre, had always been my escape, but lately even that was starting to feel stale. So when I stumbled across the table piled with second-hand electronics, something about the camcorder caught my attention. It wasn't anything fancy. A bulky 90s-era model with the faded logo of a company I'd never heard of. The seller, a scruffy middle-aged man with a weathered face, looked up as I picked it up, dusting off a few years of neglect. "You into old-school cameras?" he asked, his voice raspy but friendly. "Yeah, I collect old equipment," I said, even though I wasn't sure I could call myself a collector. It was more of a hobby, a small way to connect with the history of filmmaking. The man grinned. "Well, this one's got a little something special. It still works, just needs a new tape, that's all. Found it in a box of junk a few weeks back." I examined the camera more closely, noticing the faint scratches on the casing and the lens that seemed to have seen better days. But there was something about it that intrigued me. It wasn't just the worn appearance, it felt familiar, like it belonged to some story I hadn't yet heard. "How much?" I asked, trying to hide my growing excitement. $50, he said. I hesitated. It was more than I'd usually spend on something like this, but I was desperate for inspiration. Desperate for a spark of creativity. "Deal," I said, handing him the cash. The man grinned wider as he shoved the camera into a plastic bag. I left the flea market with a sense of satisfaction, the camera swinging by my side. It felt like fate had led me there, like this camera was exactly what I needed. When I got home, I didn't waste any time. I set up in my tiny apartment, the smell of old books and stale coffee filling the air as I plugged the camera into my TV. I had no idea what kind of footage might be on it, but I knew it was going to be interesting. The screen flickered to life, static. Then the image cleared, and I found myself staring at a dark, unfamiliar street. The camera was moving slowly, as if the person holding it was trying to be inconspicuous. I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. It wasn't like the typical found footage horror I was used to. No jump scares, no flashy editing, just raw, unsettling footage. The street was empty, lit by the dull glow of a few street lamps, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. The camera zoomed in on a nearby house. It looked abandoned, with boarded-up windows and an overgrown yard. Then the sound came, low, almost inaudible at first. A faint scraping noise. I felt a chill run down my spine. The camera panned up slowly, the view shifting from the house to the street ahead. And there, standing at the edge of the frame, was a figure. A man dressed in dark clothes, his face hidden in shadow. The camera shifted slightly, as though the person behind it was trying to get a better view. I could feel the tension mounting, and then, without warning, the figure stepped into the light. He had no face. I blinked, convinced I had imagined it. But when the image came into focus again, I could see him clearly. There was something wrong with him, something fundamentally off. His head was smooth, featureless, like a mannequin. The image wavered, and the camera shook as if the person holding it was backing away in fear. The sound of footsteps echoed in the background. My heart pounded in my chest. The camera jerked again, and the scene cut out. Static filled the screen before it returned to the same street, but this time it was completely different. The streets were quieter, and the air felt heavier. The camera zoomed in on the same house, but now the front door was ajar. I stared at the screen, my hand frozen on the remote. What the hell was this? My first instinct was to turn it off, to walk away. But something held me there. I needed to know more. This footage, whatever it was, felt real. It wasn't staged or scripted. This wasn't just a random clip. This was something I couldn't explain. I pressed play again. The door to the house creaked open further, and I saw a figure step into view. A woman, pale and disheveled, her eyes wide with terror. She looked directly into the camera as if she could see me, could sense that I was watching. And then she whispered, just barely audible, "Get out. Now." I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced. This wasn't some random junk footage. This was something real. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I knew I couldn't stop here. I had to know more. I had to find out who made this footage and why. The footage haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about it, even as I tried to focus on my own work. But I couldn't concentrate on editing my latest project or brainstorming fresh ideas. All I could think about was that faceless man and the woman who had begged me to get out. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was an obsession. I had to know who made that video, why it was on the camcorder, and most importantly, why me? I spent the next few days obsessively combing through the footage, watching it over and over, pausing at every frame, analyzing every detail. The woman's face, the eerie house, the faceless figure, it all seemed connected. But to what? Every time I tried to make sense of it, the more tangled it became. I decided to start by researching the location, that house. It had to be real. There was no way that could be fake. It looked too genuine. So I used an old mapping tool, scouring through different street views. After hours of digging, I found what I was looking for. The street, the house, it existed. It wasn't in the best neighborhood, but it was definitely in the city. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to put myself in the middle of whatever nightmare this was. But the urge to know more, to understand it, was overwhelming. I felt like I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape. That night, I grabbed the camcorder and set out to visit the location. When I arrived, the area was eerily quiet. The streets were empty, and the few people who were walking around kept their heads down, as though they had someplace more important to be. The house was just as I'd seen it in the footage. Run down, windows boarded up, weeds growing out of the cracks in the pavement. It looked abandoned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. I felt like I was being watched. I made my way down the street, keeping my distance, but as I neared the house, a sudden chill crept up my spine. I looked around nervously, but the street was empty. No one in sight. I raised the camcorder, hesitating for just a moment before pressing record. It felt insane, but I had to know. I needed to capture something real, something I could take back with me. As I approached the house, the door creaked open, just like in the footage. I froze. I swear I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, pounding louder than the rush of blood in my temples. My hand shook as I lifted the camera, my fingers trembling so badly I almost dropped it. I was too scared to move. But then, a shadow. It moved across the threshold of the door. My heart leapt into my throat. Without thinking, I bolted. I ran in the opposite direction, feeling a cold hand grip my chest. The alleyways felt like they were closing in on me. The fear was overwhelming, and I couldn't breathe fast enough. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, slamming the door behind me. It wasn't until I was sitting in my living room, panting and sweating, that I realized just how much of an idiot I had been. I was a filmmaker, not a detective. I wasn't trained to do this kind of thing. I was in over my head. But as I sat there, trying to calm my nerves, the reality began to set in. What if that footage wasn't just a random recording? What if it was a warning? I hadn't been the only person who had seen that footage. There had to be more people who had stumbled upon it, who had tried to investigate. The woman's warning kept echoing in my head. Get out. Now. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that I was in danger. But deep down, I knew I couldn't back out. I had to find out more. I had to unravel this nightmare. I didn't know who I was chasing or why, but I felt like something was closing in on me. Like I had stepped into a story that wasn't mine to tell. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next day, I reached out to a few local reporters and private investigators. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but they might know something. Someone, somewhere, had to have answers. That's when I found Sarah. She was a freelance journalist who had written a few articles about unsolved disappearances and strange events in the city. She'd covered stories about strange sightings and cold cases, nothing too sensational, but enough to catch my eye. I sent her an email explaining what I had found: the footage, the house, the figure with no face. I didn't expect a response. In fact, I thought she'd probably just brush me off as another paranoid conspiracy theorist. But to my surprise, she replied almost immediately. She said she had been investigating something similar. Apparently, a year ago, a young woman named Emily had gone missing. She had lived in that same neighborhood, near the house I'd filmed. Sarah's email said the case had gone cold, and there had been no sign of Emily or anyone else who had lived in the area for months. All her belongings had been left behind, and no one had heard from her since. I stared at my screen, my fingers gripping the edge of my desk. Could this be connected? Was Emily somehow tied to the footage I had found? I needed to know more. I had already crossed a line by seeking out the house, but this felt like I was stepping into a bigger mystery, something far darker than I had imagined, and I couldn't turn back now. I couldn't sleep that night. The more I thought about Sarah's email, the more it consumed me. Emily, the missing woman. Could she have been the woman in the footage? The one who had whispered to the camera, warning me to get out? The connection seemed too eerie to ignore. I had to find out. I spent hours scrolling through local news articles about Emily's disappearance, but there were no new developments. The case had gone cold, just like Sarah had said. No clues, no suspects, nothing to lead investigators anywhere. But there was one thing that stood out to me: the house. Emily had lived in the neighborhood, and she had disappeared without a trace. The footage I had found, it had to be more than just random. It was a piece of the puzzle. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running out of time. My gut told me that something was happening, something I wasn't meant to understand yet. I felt the pressure mounting, but I also knew that I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. I had to know what was happening behind the scenes. I met with Sarah at a small, dingy cafe a few blocks from my apartment. She was just as sharp in person as she had seemed in her emails. Early 30s, dark hair pulled back into a ponytail, her eyes always scanning the room, cautious but intense. She didn't seem surprised when I showed her the footage. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting it. "You're not the first person to find that tape," Sarah said after watching it. Her voice was quiet, almost cautious. "I've been looking into similar cases for months, trying to connect the dots. People disappear, and sometimes people find things they shouldn't." I nodded, feeling my heart race. "Do you know who made this footage?" Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of folders. She opened the top one, revealing a collection of old photographs, news clippings, and handwritten notes. She slid them toward me. "This is what I've found," she said. "Several missing persons cases in the area, all linked to that house. The most recent one was Emily. But the others, they go back decades." I flipped through the papers, my eyes widening as I read through them. There were names, dates, and blurry photographs of people who had vanished. Some of them just a few months ago, others from decades before. All of them had one thing in common: the house. That abandoned house on the corner. One of the clippings caught my eye: local woman found dead near abandoned house. A woman named Claire Turner, found 2 years ago, only her body had never been identified. The article mentioned that her death was ruled a homicide, but no one had been arrested. The house was listed as a point of interest in the case, but no leads had ever panned out. "Do you think they're all connected?" I asked, my voice shaky. Sarah leaned in, her expression serious. "I'm starting to think so. There's a pattern here. Every time someone goes missing, someone else finds something. Whether it's a tape, a note, or an object. And then they disappear too." I felt my throat tighten. I had already watched one of those tapes. And now I was investigating the same place where all these disappearances had occurred. Was I becoming part of the pattern? "But why me?" I asked. "Why did I find the tape? Why am I involved in all of this?" Sarah paused, her eyes darkening as if considering her words carefully. "I think you're being drawn in, like the others. It's almost as if the house chooses people. Those who find it Those who get too close, they become part of it, and eventually they vanish too. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It was absurd. I didn't believe in supernatural things. But as Sarah spoke, I couldn't help but feel like I was in over my head. The house wasn't just a building, it was a trap, a place that had been taking people for years, and somehow it was pulling me in too. I knew what I had to do next. "We need to go back to the house," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need to find out what's really going on there." Sarah didn't say anything at first. She just stared at me, weighing the decision. "You're not thinking clearly. If this is really as dangerous as I think it is, you shouldn't go back. We need to report this to the authorities, get them involved." I shook my head. "The police won't help. They've ignored all of this for months. I can't wait around and hope someone else figures it out. I need to see it for myself." She finally nodded, though reluctantly. "Fine. But if we're doing this, we do it carefully. No one else can know what we're doing." The tension between us was palpable, but there was no turning back now. I had crossed a line. We were both in this, whether we liked it or not. That night we met at the edge of the street where the house stood. The dark sky loomed above us, thick with clouds that barely allowed any light to break through. I could feel my pulse thumping in my throat as we made our way to the front of the house, careful not to draw attention. It felt like I was walking into a nightmare I had no hope of escaping. The house looked just as it had before, silent, ominous, and completely still. But this time, something was different. The door, which had been closed the last time I visited, was wide open. It was waiting for us. I hesitated at the entrance, the cold air biting through my jacket as Sarah and I stood at the threshold of the house. The door swung gently, creaking on its hinges as though inviting us inside. The street was eerily quiet, the faint hum of distant traffic barely cutting through the silence. For a moment, everything felt suspended, like the world was holding its breath. My heart pounded in my chest. "This is a bad idea," Sarah murmured, her voice low but tense. "We shouldn't be here. Let's just go." But I couldn't turn back. Not now. Something in me refused to let go of the need to uncover the truth. My hand gripped the camcorder tightly, the device feeling heavier than it had ever been before. I had to film this. I had to document whatever came next, no matter how dangerous or insane it seemed. I pushed the door open, stepping inside. The air was thick with dust and decay, the scent of mildew heavy in the air. The floorboards groaned under our weight as we moved cautiously through the entryway, which was surprisingly spacious. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, revealing patches of rot and the outline of where furniture had once stood. Cobwebs clung to every corner, and the faint smell of something foul lingered in the back of my throat. The house felt alive with some unseen presence, like it was watching us, waiting for us to make the wrong move. I motioned for Sarah to stay close as I moved further into the darkened hallway. The camcorder's faint red light flickered as I adjusted the lens, trying to get a clearer view of the surroundings. Every step I took felt like I was wading deeper into something I wasn't meant to understand. We reached a small living room, the remnants of a broken-down couch and a cracked coffee table scattered across the floor. At first glance, it seemed like any other abandoned house, neglected and forgotten. But then I saw something, a set of footsteps in the dust, leading toward a closed door at the back of the room. My stomach twisted. "Sarah," I whispered, "do you see that?" She nodded, her expression pale and uneasy. "Someone's been here recently. We shouldn't be—" Before she could finish, a soft noise interrupted us, a scrape of something, flesh against wood. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was coming from the door. I slowly reached for the handle, my fingers shaking. The scrape continued, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was behind the door was aware of us, toying with us. "Get back," Sarah urged, but I was already turning the knob. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the house. What lay beyond was no ordinary room. It was a small, dimly lit space, its walls lined with shelves of old books and boxes. At the center of the room was a single chair, facing toward the far wall. And in that chair, there was something, or someone. I stepped closer, my breath tight in my chest. The figure in the chair was hunched forward, unmoving. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I got closer, I could see it clearly. A man, his face obscured by shadows. He was dressed in the same dark clothing as the figure in the footage, the faceless one. My blood ran cold. "Who the hell is that?" I whispered, though the words. Sarah took a hesitant step forward, but before she could speak, the man's head jerked upward and his eyes locked onto mine. They were dark, hollow, and void of anything human. I froze, paralyzed by the intensity of his gaze. A flicker of recognition flashed through me, but I couldn't place it. Something about him seemed familiar. A cold, sinking feeling took hold of me, and my mind screamed at me to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't look away. "Why are you here?" The voice came from nowhere, as if it was in my head rather than spoken aloud. The man, if that's what he was, stood suddenly, his movements unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. He didn't say anything more. Instead, his hands reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn notebook. He held it out toward me, his face still hidden in shadow. I didn't take the notebook immediately. I was too terrified to move. Then a low voice broke the silence. "Sarah." "What? What is that?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't want to know what it was. But despite my fear, I found myself reaching for the notebook. My hand trembled as I took it from him. The moment my fingers brushed the cover, I felt a jolt like static electricity, but it was much colder, much sharper. The man stepped back, his form blending into the darkness of the room. The air grew thicker, suffocating. "We're not supposed to be here," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with panic. "We need to leave now." But it was too late. Before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind us. The room plunged into total darkness, and the temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath misting in the air. The camcorder's light flickered wildly before going out entirely. And then a sound, like something dragging across the floor, slow, methodical, a scraping noise. From the corner of the room, the figure in the chair moved. He stood, and in the dark I saw his face, or rather the lack of one. It was smooth, blank, the same as the figure in the footage. He wasn't alone. Behind him I saw other figures, more faceless people, each one standing still, watching us with silent, hollow eyes. "Run!" Sarah screamed, and before I could even react, she bolted for the door, her footsteps echoing in the silence. I followed, but something kept pulling me back. The notebook. I had to hold on to it. I turned to grab it from the ground, but by the time I looked up, I was no longer in the room. I was standing outside, the house looming behind me. The door was shut, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. I couldn't make sense of it. My mind spun in confusion as I glanced at Sarah, who was panting next to me, wide-eyed and trembling. "What the hell was that?" she gasped, her hands shaking. I looked down at the notebook in my hands, my heart still racing. I had no answers, only questions, and a feeling in the pit of my stomach. The feeling that we weren't done. That whatever I had uncovered, whatever we had just witnessed, was far from over. We didn't speak as we walked away from the house. The night had swallowed us whole, and the weight of what had just happened was pressing down on my chest. I kept my eyes on the ground, my steps quick and uneven, not wanting to look back. But no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't shake the images from my mind. The faceless figures, the cold, empty eyes, and that man standing in the dark room, offering me the notebook. I glanced down at it now, still tightly clutched in my hands. It was old, the leather cover cracked and worn, the edges frayed with age. I hadn't even opened it yet. Part of me was afraid of what I might find inside. Part of me just wanted to throw it away and forget this whole nightmare. But I couldn't. We reached Sarah's car in silence. She was trembling, her hands gripping the wheel as she started the engine. She didn't ask any questions, and neither did I. I think we both knew we were past the point of no return. I sat there, staring at the notebook. The leather was cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so. I needed to know what was inside, but I was terrified of what it might reveal. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than either of us. It was pulling us deeper into something we couldn't escape. "I don't know if we can keep doing this," Sarah said, her voice shaky. She didn't look at me, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. I don't think we're meant to understand it. I think we're part of a pattern now, just like all the others." Her words hit me harder than I expected. She was right. There was no clear way out. There was no escaping the truth of what we had uncovered, no unseeing what we had seen. "I have to open it," I said, my voice tight. The words felt like they weren't even mine, like I was being forced to say them. Sarah sighed but said nothing, only glancing over at me briefly before returning her attention to the road. I opened the notebook carefully, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the first few pages. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. It looked like someone had written in it over the years, entries, notes, and drawings that didn't make any sense at first. But then, the words on one of the pages caught my eye. "They come for those who know too much." I felt a cold shiver run through me. The handwriting was jagged, erratic, as though written in haste. I turned the page, my breath catching in my throat as I saw more cryptic lines. "The house is alive. It watches, it waits, and it chooses its next." I flipped through more pages, each one more unsettling than the last. Drawings of the faceless figures, strange symbols, and more notes that made no sense. But one thing was clear, the person who had written this knew about the house. They knew its power, its ability to pull people in, to trap them. It was like a warning, one that hadn't been finished. There were a few more pages near the end, these ones different from the others. The handwriting was darker now, almost frantic. And on the final page, there was one name written in large, bold letters: Emily. She knew the truth. She found the house. Now she is one of them. She cannot escape. I felt my stomach drop. Emily, the woman who had gone missing. She had known about the house. She had found it, just like me. And now she was one of them. I slammed the notebook shut, my hands shaking as I looked up at Sarah. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Emily found it. She knew what it was. She knew what would happen, I whispered, the words barely coming out. I couldn't even fully process them. "This is insane," Sarah muttered. "This is insane. We have to stop. We have to—" But before she could finish, the car jerked. The engine sputtered, then died. We both froze, the sound of the engine fading into nothingness. "What the hell?" Sarah said, trying to restart the car, but it didn't budge. We were in the middle of the road, miles from anywhere, and the car wouldn't start. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "It's them," I whispered. "They know where we are." We both looked around, but there was nothing, no one, just the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. But I could feel it. Something was wrong. Something was closing in. "Get out of the car," Sarah said, her voice low but frantic. I didn't argue. I grabbed the notebook, clutching it tightly in my hand as I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. The silence was deafening. The only sound was the crunch of our footsteps on the gravel, echoing in the emptiness. We walked a few paces away from the car, both of us too scared to speak. The hairs on my arms stood up, and my heart pounded in my chest. I looked around, but it was as if the world had fallen silent. There was no sound, no movement, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to swallow everything. And then I heard it. A whisper. It came from nowhere, but I heard it clearly. It was the same voice I had heard earlier in the house. The man, or whatever he was. "You're too late." The whisper cut through me like ice, and I spun around, searching for the source. But there was nothing, only the endless darkness of the night. I turned to Sarah, but she was looking past me, her face pale with fear. "Behind you," she whispered. I didn't need to look. I could already feel it. The figures. They were standing in the distance, just outside the edge of the headlights, their faceless forms barely visible in the dark. They were watching us, waiting for us to make our move. And I knew, with a sinking feeling, that we were about to be swallowed whole. The figures moved toward us slowly, almost languidly, as though they were in no hurry. But the closer they came, the more the air seemed to crackle with an unnatural energy. My breath quickened, my heart racing in my chest, but no matter how hard I tried to move, my legs felt like lead. I could hear Sarah's voice, barely a whisper, beside me. "We can't outrun them. They'll catch us. We're trapped." I turned to look at her, my mind spinning, my hands trembling. The notebook was still clutched in my grip, but its weight felt meaningless now. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the figures that were closing in. Their featureless faces, if you could call them faces, were the only thing in the world. An empty void that seemed to consume everything. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice trembling, "what do we do?" She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "There's no escape. There's never been an escape. Don't you see? They want us to understand, to know, but once we do, we're just like them. We're trapped. There's no way out." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. And for a moment I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that running was futile, that there was no point in fighting. But then I thought of Emily, of all the others who had disappeared, and how they had been drawn into the same darkness. They hadn't just vanished, they had been chosen, and somehow I was next. I gripped the notebook harder, the edges digging into my palm. There had to be a way out. I couldn't let this be the end. I couldn't become another name in the pattern, another shadow in the dark. As the figures drew closer, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't a choice I consciously made, but something deep inside me told me what I had to do. The only way to escape this was to face the truth, to understand what the house, the figures, and the darkness wanted from us. I turned to Sarah, my voice low but urgent. "We need to go back to the house. We need to find the heart of it all." She shook her head violently. "No, that's what they want. That's how it all starts. The house. It's what draws us in. We can't—" I grabbed her shoulders, desperate. "Sarah, listen to me. We have to go back. If we don't, we'll never get out of here. We'll never be free." She was silent for a moment, her eyes flickering between the approaching figures and me. The air felt heavy, oppressive, but something in her expression shifted. Maybe it was the desperation in my voice, or maybe it was the realization that we had no other choice. But finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But we need to do it quickly, and we need to be ready for whatever comes next." We started walking toward the house, every step feeling heavier than the last. The figures didn't follow us, not yet, but I could feel their presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't look back. If I did, I was sure I would be lost. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the night sky. The door was still open, just like before. As we approached, I felt the ground beneath my feet seem to shift, like the earth itself was moving to draw us in. "Stay close," Sarah muttered, her voice tense, as we crossed the threshold of the house. The moment we stepped inside, the air thickened. The temperature dropped even further, and the house seemed to close in around us, like it was a living thing, breathing and waiting. The walls seemed to shift with each passing second, the floor creaking beneath our feet as we made our way down the hallway. It was like walking through a nightmare, the shadows bending in strange shapes, whispering in voices that made my skin crawl. We reached the room at the end of the hall, the same one where we had found the faceless man. This time it was different. The door was already open, the room bathed in a sickly dim light. And there, in the center of the room, was something new. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. It was a shape, a swirling mass of shadows and light, constantly shifting, like a living void. And in the center of it, I could see something, or someone, moving. It was what had been pulling us in. It was the heart of the house, the force behind everything. I stepped forward, my body moving before my mind could catch up. The notebook was burning in my hands now, its pages practically vibrating with energy. I opened it again, frantically searching for something, anything, that might tell me what this thing was. And then I saw it. The final entry. "To escape, you must sacrifice what you love the most." I froze, my blood running cold. "Sacrifice," I whispered, my voice cracking. "What does that mean?" Sarah looked at me, her face pale and strained. "We have to make a choice," she said softly. "We have to give up something, or someone, to break the cycle." I stared at the swirling mass in the center of the room. The figures were here now, standing in the corners, watching silently. They were waiting for us to make our move. I looked at Sarah. I knew what I had to do. I knew what the house was asking. But I didn't want to. I can't," I whispered, my eyes welling up with tears. "I can't do this." But then the voice came again, the same one I had heard in the dark. You will." And with that, the house seemed to pulse, the shadows closing in, and everything went dark. I was falling into a darkness so complete I couldn't even tell up from down. The air around me was suffocating, thick and icy, as though I was drowning in something that wasn't quite water. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the endless blackness. Every muscle in my body felt paralyzed, frozen in place as though some unseen force was holding me down, trapping me in the void. And then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. I blinked, the world slowly returning to me in fragments. At first, there was nothing but a sharp, pulsing light. It was blinding, but it didn't burn. It was the light of the house, the heart of the house, the source of everything. I was standing again. The shadows were gone, and so were the figures. For a moment, I thought it was over, that we had escaped, that I had made the right choice. But then I realized something even worse. Sarah was gone. I looked around in a panic, my heart hammering in my chest. The house felt wrong. It was quieter than it had ever been, and the walls seemed to pulse with a sickly energy, as though they were alive. The notebook was still in my hand, but it felt cold now, heavier. I opened it once more, hoping for some kind of guidance, some kind of answer. The page I turned to was blank. I could feel the dread creeping in, and that's when I saw her, Sarah. She was standing in the middle of the room, facing away from me. The same place we had stood moments before, the same place where the faceless figures had gathered. But now there was something wrong. Her body was stiff, unmoving, her back rigid as though she had been frozen in place. But as I took a step closer, my breath caught in my throat. Her head turned slowly, unnaturally, until her eyes locked onto mine. They were empty, hollow. "Sarah," I whispered, but she didn't respond. She didn't move. The darkness swirled around her, seeping into her body, filling the hollow void where her eyes should have been. Her form began to distort, becoming more like one of the faceless figures, her skin turning ashen and stretched. The very air seemed to recoil from her, and I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I took another step, but then she whispered my name. "You have to choose." Her voice was wrong, distant, warped by whatever force had taken hold of her. And then it hit me. The choice. The sacrifice. This was the moment. The house wanted me to choose, to give something up in exchange for my freedom. I stepped closer to her, my chest tight with fear and guilt. Her face was still distorted, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a sliver of the friend I had known beneath the horror. "What do I do, Sarah?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Please, tell me what to do." For a moment, she didn't answer. She just stood there, her body flickering between her true form and the monstrous one the house had twisted her into. And then, finally, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "It's me. It's always been me. But you have to choose. You have to let me go. You have to let it take me." I felt the tears welling in my eyes. I couldn't do it. I couldn't let her go. I couldn't lose her. But she was right. The house was never going to let us go unless we played by its rules. It needed the sacrifice, and it would take whoever was closest to me, whoever had the most meaning in my life. "Let me go," she repeated, her voice growing fainter, more distant. "You have to make the choice. I'm already lost." The weight of the decision pressed down on me like 1,000 tons, suffocating me. It wasn't just about choosing to save myself. It was about what it would cost. I looked at her one last time, her face now completely blank, the house claiming her, pulling her into its void. The twisted shadows began to swallow her whole, dragging her deeper into the darkness. I couldn't save her. I turned away, the notebook burned in my hand. A part of me had hoped it would stop, that the choice would be taken away, that the house would somehow show mercy. But it didn't. The notebook was still there, its empty pages staring at me, waiting for the final step. And then I knew. I had to destroy it. I ripped the notebook from its spine, the pages falling away like dry leaves in the wind. I scattered the pieces into the air, and the house trembled. The lights flickered, the walls groaned. The floor cracked, and the entire house seemed to shift, its shape collapsing in on itself. The ground shook beneath my feet, and I fell to my knees. But it didn't stop. The house wasn't just a place. It was something more, something that couldn't be destroyed so easily. The darkness wasn't confined to its walls. It was inside me now. The whispers started again, louder than before, filling my ears, suffocating my mind. "You chose," they hissed. "Now you are one of us." The air thickened, the light dimming. I looked around, my mind racing. There was no escape. And then, in the distance, I saw them. The faceless figures. They were standing in the doorway, watching me. They were waiting for me to join them. I couldn't move. My limbs felt frozen, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized the truth. I was already too far gone. The house had claimed me, had twisted my fate. I had become part of its pattern, its cycle. There was no more choice. There was only darkness.